Ethan Harper stood at the edge of his penthouse balcony, looking out over the glittering skyline of Manhattan. The city stretched beneath him like a sprawling tapestry of ambition, a million lives pulsing in rhythm to the heartbeat of commerce. Below, the streets were alive with people scurrying about their day, unaware of the quiet observer above them. From this height, the noise of the world seemed distant, muffled, as though a velvet curtain separated him from the chaos. He exhaled slowly, his breath mixing with the cool evening air, as the golden lights of the city bathed his face in a soft glow. Yet, despite the view, breathtaking in its own way, Ethan felt nothing. He'd become accustomed to this emptiness. A billionaire by the age of 45, he had it all. A luxurious penthouse in the heart of Manhattan, a fleet of high-end cars, business jets at his disposal, and an empire that stretched across the globe. Every desire, every material want had been met 1,000 times over. But even as the world admired his wealth, he felt a profound isolation, a hollow pit inside that no amount of luxury could fill. He glanced down at the pristine wristwatch adorning his left wrist, the polished steel gleaming under the light. A gift from his late father, it was one of the few things that anchored him to a past he had long since outgrown. His father had been a self-made man, driven by hard work and a relentless pursuit of success. Ethan had inherited that drive, but somewhere along the way, he'd lost touch with the emotional core of his existence. The door behind him creaked open, and a voice, smooth and light as a breeze, called out to him. "Ethan, you ready?" Emma Kingston stepped onto the balcony, her presence almost ethereal. She was everything Ethan was not, young, free, and full of life. Her auburn hair shimmered in the soft light of the city, and her eyes, bright with unspoken promise, locked onto his as if she were the missing piece to the puzzle he hadn't known he was trying to solve. Emma was his mistress, a title he was comfortable with, but one he never allowed to take deeper root in his mind. He'd met her a year ago at a gala in the Hamptons, where she'd caught his eye with a smile that seemed to defy all the cynicism that had taken root in him over the years. She was a rising star in the world of interior design, but what attracted him most was her youth and vitality, her ability to remind him of the passions he had buried beneath the weight of his wealth and responsibilities. "Almost," Ethan replied, his voice tinged with the same detachment that colored his every interaction. He didn't mean to be cold, but he had learned long ago that vulnerability, emotion, and intimacy only complicated things. He took a last look at the skyline, feeling the ever-present emptiness gnawing at him. Emma moved closer, wrapping her arms around his waist and leaning her head against his chest. He didn't pull away. He never did. There was something about her, something magnetic, that drew him in despite himself. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was never truly seen. Not by her. Not by anyone. "Are we really doing this?" she asked, her voice quiet but insistent, as though reading his thoughts. "I mean, you know that Claire's going to find out eventually, right?" Ethan stiffened slightly, the name of his wife cutting through the fog of his thoughts. Claire, his wife of 20 years, his partner in the most successful business venture of his life. She had been his equal, his confidant, and the person he had once thought he couldn't live without. But now, she felt more like a distant memory, a part of a life that seemed as far away from him as the stars above. Claire had her own empire to run, an architect, brilliant in her own right, but increasingly absorbed by the demands of her career. She had always been strong, capable, and distant. That distance had grown over the years, a silent rift forming between them that neither had dared to acknowledge. The last time they had truly connected was years ago, before their world had become a series of meetings, negotiations, and obligations. Ethan's lips tightened at the thought of Claire. He wasn't proud of his affair with Emma, but it was the only thing that brought him a semblance of joy these days. Yet, despite the moments of passion, despite the thrill of their secret encounters, he knew that this too was only temporary. Emma's youth and charm could never fill the void that gnawed at him, that hollow space where love should have been. "I'm not sure what you mean," Ethan said, his words clipped. He didn't want to discuss Claire right now. He didn't want to admit that his marriage was a shell of what it had once been. Instead, he turned to face Emma, forcing a smile. "Let's not think about her right now. We have this weekend." Emma raised an eyebrow. "We always have this weekend, don't we?" "But what about when the weekend's over? What happens then?" Ethan didn't have an answer for that. What did happen when the weekend was over? He would return to his sterile penthouse. Claire would be waiting, the same cool, detached woman she had become over the years, and the cycle would begin again. Another week of business deals, meetings and dinners with people who saw him only for his wealth, never for the man beneath the polished exterior. As Emma stepped back to adjust her jacket, the realization hit him with a sharp sting. He didn't know if he was even capable of real connection anymore. "You ready to go?" she asked, giving him a playful wink. Ethan nodded, masking the turmoil that bubbled just beneath the surface. They had a private jet waiting, and he would follow her to the Hamptons as he always did, because what else was there? His life, despite its opulence, had become a series of performances, and Emma was merely another act in the ongoing drama of his existence. As they walked toward the elevator, Ethan stole one last look at the Manhattan skyline, its beauty now tinged with an unbearable sadness. The city had always been a symbol of everything he had ever wanted, but now it felt like a cage, a gilded prison, and no matter how many weekends he spent in the Hamptons or how many women he surrounded himself with, he couldn't escape the truth that haunted him. Nothing could fill the emptiness. The private jet's engines hummed softly as it soared above the clouds, the rhythmic sound a far cry from the tension coiling within Ethan's chest. The cabin was elegant, understated luxury in every corner, a far cry from the chaos of his mind. He sat across from Emma, who had settled comfortably into her seat, her legs crossed with a casual grace that seemed at odds with the moment. She glanced out the window, watching the city below fade into the distance, her eyes lost in thought. The silence between them was more profound than he cared to admit, and it gnawed at him. Was this all they had? A weekend here and there, fleeting moments in the midst of lives that would otherwise continue on without either of them? "Ethan!" Emma's voice broke the silence, soft yet carrying an edge. She turned toward him, her expression thoughtful but guarded. "You're quiet today." He offered a tight smile, forcing his gaze to meet hers. "Just thinking," he said, though the truth was far more complicated. There was too much to think about, too much he didn't know how to confront. Emma arched an eyebrow, her lips curving into something resembling a smirk. "About what? Me? Or her?" Her voice dropped on the word her, the possessiveness barely concealed behind a veil of light-heartedness. Ethan stiffened slightly at the mention of Claire. He wasn't in the mood for Emma's usual playful digs about his wife, but he couldn't entirely blame her. He had set the stage for this dynamic long ago, allowing his marriage to fray while indulging in the comfort of Emma's youth and beauty. Still, he wasn't sure if he could handle this conversation right now, not with the weight of his growing dissatisfaction pressing on him from all sides. "What does it matter, Emma?" he replied, his voice colder than he intended. "You know I'm here with you, don't you?" "Isn't that enough?" She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied him with an intensity that made him feel exposed. Then, she leaned back in her seat and sighed, a sound filled with frustration. "I don't know," she said, her tone tinged with a raw honesty that made Ethan uneasy. Is it enough, Ethan? Am I really enough? Her words lingered in the air, and for a moment the only sound was the hum of the jet's engines. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, a pang of guilt rising from somewhere deep within him. The question caught him off guard, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't have an answer. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze flitting to the window, trying to hide from the weight of her eyes. I told you, Emma. I'm here. I'm with you. What more do you want from me? Emma's laugh was low, almost bitter. What more do I want? I want you to stop lying to yourself. You think I don't see it? You think I don't feel it, Ethan? He opened his mouth to respond, but she raised a hand to stop him. You think I don't know what I am to you? She continued, her voice a mix of hurt and resignation. I'm the distraction, the momentary escape. The beautiful woman you can play with while your real life is waiting for you back in Manhattan. But that's all I am, isn't it? A pretty little secret that you can slip into your pocket when you need to feel something real. Her words stung more than he expected, and his silence only seemed to confirm what she had said. Emma's gaze never left him, and for the first time, she wasn't playing the role of the carefree, charming mistress. She was raw and vulnerable, her facade cracking before him. I never asked for more, Ethan said quietly, the words slipping out before he could think. You knew what this was. What this is. I thought I did, Emma replied, her voice softening, but the hurt was still there. But now I'm not so sure. She swallowed hard as though trying to push down the emotions threatening to rise. I thought I could handle being the other woman. I thought I could handle being your woman. But it's not enough anymore. And it hasn't been for a while. Ethan felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. There was nothing he could say to ease the tension between them. Emma had always known their relationship was built on impermanence. He had kept it that way, safe, uncomplicated until now. But the cracks in their dynamic were starting to show, and no amount of money or distractions could seal them up. I'm sorry, Ethan said, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. I didn't mean to hurt you. Emma's eyes softened for a moment, the edge of her frustration momentarily replaced by something else, something closer to pity. But it was fleeting, gone almost as quickly as it came. We'll see, she said, her voice distant now, as if she had already started to shut down the conversation. She turned her attention back to the window, her gaze once again fixed on the passing clouds, as if seeking answers in the endless stretch of sky. Ethan sat back in his seat, his mind swirling with a mixture of regret and confusion. He hadn't expected this weekend to unravel in this way, to be forced to confront the deeper questions he had been avoiding for so long. But Emma had made him face something he hadn't wanted to admit, not even to himself. The truth was, he had never fully committed to her, to their relationship. He had been playing a part, just as he had been in his marriage to Claire. He had convinced himself that wealth could make up for the emptiness he felt inside, that success could compensate for the lack of genuine connection. But somewhere along the way the lines had blurred, and now he was left with the realization that neither Emma nor Claire could fill the hollow space within him. The jet continued its journey through the clouds, but Ethan felt more grounded than he ever had before, caught between two worlds, each pulling him in opposite directions, neither offering the solace he so desperately needed. The private jet landed in the Hamptons, just as the last rays of sunlight kissed the horizon, casting a golden hue over the sprawling beach house that awaited them. The estate was a luxurious blend of modern elegance and coastal charm, large windows framing expansive views of the ocean, sprawling lawns, and a pristine pool that glittered like a diamond under the fading light. Ethan stepped off the plane first, the soft breeze tousling his hair, but his mind was still caught in the whirlwind of emotions that had followed Emma's words. He had thought this trip would be a temporary escape, just another weekend to shut out the reality of his life. But now, something had shifted. Emma's quiet confession had broken through the walls he had so carefully built around himself, and the realization that he had failed both her and Claire lingered like a heavy weight on his chest. Emma followed behind him, her footsteps light, but her posture rigid. Ethan could sense the change in her, the distance that had crept between them since their conversation on the jet. Her energy was no longer the carefree vitality that had first drawn him to her. Now she seemed distant, lost in her own thoughts, as though the easy, fleeting nature of their relationship had slipped through her fingers. He glanced at her, but she was looking down at her phone, her lips pursed. He had been so consumed by his own emotional turmoil that he hadn't even noticed the shift in her behavior. He had assumed Emma was just the thrill of the moment, someone to fill the void for a while, but now he couldn't help but wonder if he had underestimated her, if he had been blind to her own feelings and needs. "You know, I never really understood why you like this place so much," Emma said, breaking the silence as they reached the front door. Her voice was softer now, almost reflective. "It's beautiful, of course, but I don't know. There's something about it that feels so empty." Ethan didn't answer right away, instead staring at the house in front of them. The pristine facade, the gleaming glass, the lush gardens, everything about it screamed success. But Emma's words echoed in his mind. Was she right? Was it all just a facade? The grand front door swung open, and the housekeeper greeted them with a warm smile. Ethan nodded in acknowledgement, then turned to Emma, forcing a smile he didn't quite feel. "I guess we'll find out soon enough, won't we?" he replied, his voice lacking the usual conviction. As they stepped inside, the house seemed to swallow them whole. The vast space was both breathtaking and isolating. The high ceilings, the expansive living room, the endless views of the ocean. It was all designed to impress, to make a statement. But in that moment, all Ethan felt was the emptiness that came with a life filled with things, but lacking in connection. They were shown to their rooms by the housekeeper, Ethan's, as always, overlooking the beach, and Emma's just down the hall, offering a perfect view of the sprawling gardens. She paused in the doorway, glancing back at Ethan, a thoughtful expression on her face. "I'll meet you downstairs for dinner," she said, her voice cool. "Sure," Ethan replied, watching her as she closed the door softly behind her. There was something about the way she said it, something that made him feel like she was already slipping away from him. Ethan wandered to the window, his thoughts a tangle of guilt, frustration, and confusion. He had built this life, this world of luxury and success, but it wasn't bringing him happiness. He couldn't keep pretending that it was enough. The affair with Emma had started as a distraction, but now it felt like it was unraveling. And Claire, his wife, his partner for so many years, was never far from his mind. Was he simply doomed to repeat the same mistakes over and over again? Was this all life had to offer? A cycle of fleeting pleasure and inevitable disappointment? He didn't know anymore. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He turned, expecting Emma, but instead found James, his assistant, standing in the doorway with a neutral expression. "Ethan," James said, his voice calm, almost detached. "We need to talk." Ethan raised an eyebrow, his pulse quickening. "What's going on?" James stepped inside, closing the door behind him. There was an air of urgency in his demeanor that immediately made Ethan's stomach tighten. James had always been the level-headed one, the one who kept him grounded. But tonight, something about him seemed different, off. "It's the business," James began, his tone measured but laced with an underlying tension. "There's been a situation with the properties in Miami. The press is starting to get wind of some discrepancies. If it gets out, it could damage your reputation and the company." Ethan's stomach dropped. His mind flashed to the recent high-profile deal in Miami, a multi-million-dollar project that had been the crown jewel of his latest business venture. A potential scandal was the last thing he needed, especially now with his personal life in turmoil. "Damn it," Ethan muttered, running a hand through his hair. "How bad is it?" "We need to act fast," James replied. "There are a few leaks already, and we've got to contain this before it spirals out of control. I've already contacted the PR team, but we need your direction. This could be bigger than we thought." Ethan's thoughts raced as he processed the information. The weight of the situation hit him with brutal force. This was the kind of crisis that could tear everything down: his company, his reputation, everything he had built. And yet, even as the gravity of the situation sank in, another thought gnawed at him. Was he so consumed by this business empire, by his pursuit of wealth, that he had lost sight of what truly mattered? James could see the conflict playing out on Ethan's face. "You need to decide what's more important," James said, his voice softer now. "Your legacy, your reputation, or the people you care about. You can't keep juggling both forever." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. Could he really keep living this way? Trapped between his marriage, his affair, and his empire, all while failing to truly connect with anyone? Could he keep pretending that his wealth and power were enough to fill the emptiness inside? He didn't know the answer yet. But something inside him was beginning to change. The dinner table was set beneath the expansive windows of the beach house, the soft glow of candlelight flickering over the polished wood. The scent of grilled fish and fresh herbs filled the air, but Ethan couldn't shake the weight in his chest, the tension that had followed him all day. He had planned this weekend to be a chance to escape everything: the mess of his marriage, the pressure of his business, the uncertainty in his own heart. But it seemed that every corner he turned only led him deeper into himself, deeper into the realization that nothing in his life was as it seemed. As he sat down at the table, he stole a glance at Emma, who was already seated across from him. She looked stunning, as always. Her golden hair was swept into soft waves, and her dress, an elegant, sleeveless number in deep navy, clung to her curves in all the right ways. Yet, despite her beauty, there was a subtle shift in her demeanor that Ethan couldn't ignore. The playful, flirtatious energy she usually exuded was absent tonight. She had withdrawn into herself, and every word she spoke felt like it was coated in a layer of frost. Ethan could sense the distance between them, the unspoken words hanging in the air like an invisible wall. She avoided his gaze, focusing instead on the wine glass in front of her, swirling the red liquid absent-mindedly. The easy companionship they once shared now felt strained, as though they were both playing parts in a story neither of them believed in anymore. "You're quiet," Ethan said, trying to break the silence, his voice betraying his unease. Emma didn't look up. "I'm fine," she said, her tone clipped. Ethan's chest tightened. "You don't seem fine." "I'm just tired, Ethan," she replied, her voice tinged with something sharp. "Tired of pretending. Tired of this whole thing." Her words struck him like a physical blow, the sting of truth cutting through the pretenses they had built around themselves. For a moment, Ethan didn't know what to say. He had always thought of Emma as a distraction, someone to fill the gaps when the loneliness became too much to bear. But now, as he looked at her, he saw something else in her eyes. Disappointment. Regret. "I never asked for this," she continued, her voice quiet, almost fragile. "I never asked to be the other woman, and I'm tired of feeling like I'm just something you can throw away when it doesn't suit you." Ethan's throat tightened, and for the first time he felt a twinge of guilt so sharp it almost made him gasp. Emma's words were raw, honest, and they cut deeper than any criticism he had ever received. He had always thought he could compartmentalize his life, his marriage, his affair, his empire. But Emma was forcing him to face the consequences of living in a world of his own making. "Emma," he began, his voice softer now, laced with regret. "I didn't mean for it to be like this." Emma looked up at him then, her eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity that made his pulse quicken. "But it is like this, Ethan. You've been living a lie, and I've been playing along because I thought I was enough. But I'm not. And that's not on me. That's on you." The words hit him harder than he expected, and the room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The business crisis back in Manhattan, the tension with Claire, it all seemed so distant now, overshadowed by the gravity of this conversation. He realized as he sat there across from Emma that he had been living in a constant state of avoidance. He avoided facing the truth about his marriage. He avoided confronting the emptiness that gnawed at him from within. And now Emma was asking him to stop pretending, to stop running. She sighed, leaning back in her chair, and for a moment Ethan could have sworn she looked broken. "I don't want this anymore, Ethan. I can't keep being the woman you run to when your life is too much to handle. I want something real, something whole, and I don't think you're capable of giving that to me. Not now. Not ever." Her words lingered in the air long after she spoke them, hanging between them like a heavy fog. Ethan sat in stunned silence, his mind racing as he tried to process what she had said. He had never thought about Emma in terms of her own needs, her own desires. She had always been a part of the world he could control, someone who existed outside the demands of his business and his marriage, someone who existed for him when he needed her. But now, her rejection was like a mirror, reflecting all the parts of himself he had tried to hide from. He wasn't sure if he felt relief or fear. All his life, he had surrounded himself with things he could control, wealth, power, status. But now it seemed as though everything was slipping through his fingers. "Emma," Ethan said, his voice breaking for the first time in years, "I never wanted to hurt you." She nodded, her gaze softening but only slightly. "I know you didn't, but you did, and I think you've done the same to Claire, to everyone you've ever been close to. You've built your empire, Ethan, but you've built it on sand, and it's all starting to crumble." Her words stung, but they also rang true. He had spent so long chasing success, striving to build something lasting, something that would define him, something that would make him feel worthy. But what was the point of all that if it meant destroying the very things that were supposed to give his life meaning? Ethan's heart tightened in his chest, and for a moment he couldn't find the words to respond. What could he possibly say to her? Could he explain the emptiness that had driven him into the arms of another woman? Could he explain how he had tried to fill the hollow spaces of his life with everything except what truly mattered? Claire's eyes softened, but there was no forgiveness in them. Not yet, anyway. "I can't pretend this isn't happening anymore," she continued. "I can't keep pretending that I don't see the cracks in our marriage. I can't keep pretending that I'm okay with being married to a man who has built an empire and destroyed his family in the process." The weight of her words pressed down on him, heavier than anything he had ever felt before. For the first time in years, he felt like the man he had become was unrecognizable. And he didn't know how to fix it, didn't know if it could be fixed. "I never meant to hurt you, Claire," he said, his voice raw with guilt. "I never wanted this. I don't know how we got here, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." Claire shook her head, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and anger. "It's not just about what you want, Ethan. It's about what we need. And right now what we need is honesty. What we need is for you to face the truth." Ethan's breath caught in his throat, the reality of the situation finally settling in. His life, the life he had built, was unraveling before him. The business, the money, the fame, none of it mattered if he didn't have Claire, if he didn't have the one thing that had once made everything else worthwhile. "I know I've failed you," Ethan said, his voice trembling slightly, "and I'm sorry. I'm so damn sorry. But I don't want to lose you, Claire. I don't want to lose everything." Claire's expression softened just a fraction, but she didn't let him off the hook. "You've been losing me for years, Ethan, and I'm not sure I can keep fighting for a man who's not here, even when he's in the same room. I've been fighting alone for too long." The silence that followed was thick, heavy with the weight of her words. Ethan wanted to reach out to her, to pull her close and make everything right, but he knew that was no longer his decision to make. Claire had reached her breaking point, and he wasn't sure if there was anything left between them to save. "I don't know what comes next," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't keep living like this." Ethan stared at her, his heart aching with a deep, almost unbearable pain. He had thought he could control everything, his wealth, his business, his relationships. But now, as he looked at Claire, he realized that the one thing he couldn't control was his own heart. "I'm sorry," he repeated, his voice hoarse. "I'm sorry for everything." Claire turned and walked toward the door, but just before she left, she paused, looking back at him one last time. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Ethan, not yet, but I'm not going to pretend anymore. Not for you, not for anyone." And with that, she was gone. The sun had sunk below the horizon, casting the Hamptons into a soft, indigo dusk. Ethan stood by the window of his room, staring out at the ocean, but he wasn't seeing the waves. He wasn't seeing the steady ebb and flow of the tide that had always been so soothing to him. All he could see was Claire's face, the raw hurt in her eyes, the way her words had cut through him like a blade. She had left, not just the room, but the entire life they had built together. Claire had made her decision, and Ethan was left standing in the wreckage of it all. He had spent his life creating this empire, building something that he thought would provide him with everything he ever wanted: success, admiration, security. But as he stood there in the silence, he realized that all of it had come at the cost of the one thing that truly mattered: connection. Real connection. With Claire. With Emma. The soft click of the door behind him jolted him from his thoughts. He turned to find Emma standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. She looked different, more fragile somehow, as though the weight of the previous evening had already started to take its toll on her. She was dressed in a simple cream-colored sweater and jeans, her hair loose around her shoulders. It was the first time in days that she didn't seem like the vibrant, untouchable woman who had walked into his life a year ago. Now she seemed just as lost as he was. "I thought you'd be gone by now," Ethan said quietly, his voice carrying the remnants of exhaustion and guilt. Emma didn't answer right away. Instead, she crossed the room slowly, her steps deliberate. She seemed to be looking for something, perhaps an answer she couldn't find, a way to make sense of the confusion they both felt. "I was going to leave," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But then I thought, maybe we need to talk." Ethan swallowed hard, his chest tightening. He had always been able to escape difficult conversations, running away from reality into the arms of his wealth, his business, or his other distractions. But right now, there was no escaping. Not with Emma, not with Claire. He was cornered, trapped in the truth of his own mistakes. "Talk?" he repeated, his voice hoarse. "What's there to talk about, Emma? You were right. I've been living a lie, and now it's all falling apart." Emma didn't move, but the way her eyes searched his, so full of emotion, so vulnerable, made his heart ache in a way he didn't know it could. For the first time, he saw the woman behind the glamour, the facade. Emma had been a means of escape for him, someone he thought would fill the emptiness, but in reality, she was just as lost as he was. "You never wanted me, Ethan," Emma said softly, her words like a soft sigh in the room. "Not in the way that I wanted you. You wanted a distraction, a momentary escape. And maybe, at first, I was okay with that. Maybe I convinced myself I was okay with that." Ethan's throat tightened. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. How could he explain the emptiness he had carried with him all these years? How could he explain the loneliness that had driven him into her arms in the first place? He had tried to find solace in wealth, in power, in Emma, but it had never been enough. He had always known that. But now, hearing her voice crack with emotion, he realized that he had never truly seen her. Not really. "But I'm not okay with it anymore," Emma continued, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'm tired of being a temporary fix, Ethan. I'm tired of being someone you only turn to when you need a distraction from your real life. I want more than that. And you're not capable of giving it to me. Not now. Not after everything." Ethan felt his heart sink. The truth in her words hit him like a tidal wave, and he couldn't breathe. He had never understood what Emma needed from him. He had never asked. He had assumed their relationship was built on a mutual understanding of what it was: fleeting, temporary. But Emma was looking for something deeper, something he couldn't offer. He stepped toward her, but she took a step back, her gaze hardening slightly. "I'm not here for your apology, Ethan," she said, her voice steady now, though her eyes were full of emotion. "I'm here because I need to make a choice. And so do you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with significance. Ethan didn't know how to respond. The weight of everything that had happened, everything he had failed to see, was too much to bear. His chest constricted as he looked at her. This woman who had given him everything, her heart, her trust, and he had squandered it all. "Do you love me, Ethan?" Emma's voice broke through the fog in his mind, pulling him back to the present. She was looking at him with an intensity that made him feel as though she could see through every mask, every defense he had ever put up. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. He had never been good at love, not really, not in the way that mattered. He had loved Claire once, but somewhere along the way that love had faded into routine. He had convinced himself that his success, his wealth, were enough to fill the void that had formed between them. But now, standing in front of Emma, he saw the truth. He had never really loved either of them. He had loved the idea of love, the image of it, but never the reality. "I don't know," he whispered, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. "I don't know if I ever did." The silence between them grew thick, suffocating. Emma looked away, blinking back tears, and for a moment, Ethan thought she might break. But she didn't. Instead, she turned toward the door, her back to him, and paused before speaking again. "You need to figure it out, Ethan," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "You need to figure out who you want to be. Because right now I don't know who you are, and I don't think you do either." And then she was gone. Ethan stood there, his breath caught in his chest, as the sound of her footsteps echoed down the hall. He was alone again, truly alone for the first time in his life, and this time there was no wealth, no empire, no power to shield him from the truth. He was lost. The hours after Emma left were the longest Ethan had ever experienced. The sun had set, and the house was draped in the kind of silence that was almost suffocating. He wandered through the sprawling rooms, the grand windows offering a view of the ocean, now dark and restless. The gentle crash of waves against the shore was all that filled the stillness. But it wasn't enough to drown the weight of his thoughts. He had tried to fool himself for years that his wealth, his achievements, would shield him from the emptiness inside. But now, with Emma gone and Claire distant, the illusion had shattered. All he had left was a life he didn't recognize, and a loneliness that no amount of money or success could cure. He sat on the edge of the expansive sofa in the living room, his fingers drumming absently on the armrest. There had been a time when he had believed that the constant pursuit of more money, more power, more control, would bring him fulfillment. But it hadn't. Nothing had. And now, as he stared out at the darkened sky, he couldn't help but wonder if it was too late to change. The doorbell rang, a sharp sound that broke the quiet. Ethan froze. He wasn't expecting anyone. Certainly not after the events of the day. But when he stood to answer the door, the visitor was not who he expected. It was Claire. She stood in the doorway, her face softened by the evening light but still unreadable. She looked almost out of place here, as though the house, the wealth, the life he had built for them both, was foreign to her now. She wasn't wearing the usual polished look he was accustomed to. No suit, no heels, no designer handbag. Just a simple coat and a tired look in her eyes. "Claire," Ethan said, his voice thick with a mix of surprise and hope. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I know," she said, her voice even but with an edge of vulnerability that made his heart tighten. "I wasn't sure I was going to come either." She stepped inside, the chill of the evening air clinging to her coat. Ethan moved aside, allowing her to enter. "I wasn't sure where else to go," she said, more to herself than to him. Her eyes flickered around the room, but she didn't sit. Instead, she lingered by the door, as if unsure of how to move forward. Ethan could feel the tension between them, thick and palpable. It had been years since they had truly communicated with each other, and yet, here they were, both of them searching for something that had been missing for far too long. His chest ached with the thought that he might have already lost her. "You said we needed to talk," Claire continued, her gaze locking onto his. "So talk." Ethan's throat tightened. He had never been good with words, especially the ones that mattered. He wasn't prepared for this conversation. How could he be? After everything that had happened, everything he had done, how could he possibly explain it? But the truth hung in the air, undeniable, and he knew that he had to speak it now or risk losing Claire for good. I've been selfish, Claire," he said, his voice hoarse. "I've been a coward. I didn't face the truth about myself or about us. I thought I could escape the emptiness, fill it with power, with work, with Emma. But I was wrong. I can't fix this by pretending it doesn't exist." Claire's eyes softened for a moment, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she walked further into the room, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. "You've always been able to fix things, Ethan," she said quietly. "You've always been able to build and achieve, to make everything look perfect on the outside. But the inside, the real part, has been falling apart for years, and I was too caught up in my own life to see it." Ethan swallowed, a knot forming in his stomach. "I didn't want you to see it. I didn't want anyone to see how broken I was." "You don't have to pretend with me anymore," Claire said, her voice steady but tinged with pain. "Not after everything we've been through. Not after everything you've put us through." Ethan flinched at her words. They weren't accusations, not really. But they were truths, harsh and painful, and they cut deep. She was right. He had put up walls, hid behind the success he had created, and in the process had allowed their marriage to wither. "I've been so consumed by everything I thought mattered," Ethan confessed, his voice trembling now. "But the truth is, I've neglected the only thing that ever really did matter. You. United States. I don't know how to fix it, but I know I can't keep going down this path. I've lost sight of everything that was real." Claire didn't say anything at first. She simply stood there, watching him, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of all the unspoken words. "I don't know what I'm asking for, Claire," Ethan said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "But I can't lose you. I can't lose what we had. Please. I need you. I don't want to face this life without you." Claire's gaze softened, her eyes filling with a mix of sadness and something else. Something like longing. Something like hope. "You've already lost me, Ethan," she said quietly, her words a gentle blow to his chest. "At least the woman I used to be. The woman who believed in you. In us." Ethan felt his chest tighten, his throat constricting with emotion. "I know I've hurt you," he whispered. "I've hurt you more than I ever could have imagined. And I'm sorry. I am. But I don't know how to make it right. I don't know where to start." Claire took a step closer, her gaze searching his. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said quietly, her voice tinged with pain. "But I can't just walk away either. I've spent too many years with you, building something that, in the end, didn't bring us happiness. We've both changed, Ethan, and maybe that's okay." Ethan's heart raced as he stepped closer to her. The distance between them was closing, but the space between their hearts was still vast. He wasn't sure if they could fix what had been broken, but for the first time, he realized that they would have to try. He had to try. "I don't have all the answers," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'll spend the rest of my life trying to find them. For you, for us." Claire studied him for a long moment, the silence stretching again. And then, finally, she spoke. "Maybe we can start by being honest. About everything. And maybe that's where it begins." Ethan nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of hope and fear. This was the beginning of something. He wasn't sure what, but it was a start, and that was all he could ask for. Ethan lay awake that night, his mind racing with the conversation he had just shared with Claire. The weight of her words, her pain, and the hollow space that had existed between them for so long lingered in the air. The house, which had once been a symbol of his success, now felt cold and empty, a reminder of all the things he had sacrificed for a life that, in the end, had left him hollow. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Claire's face, her expression a mix of grief and quiet resolve. She hadn't promised him anything, no forgiveness, no second chance, but she hadn't turned away completely either. And yet, as he stared out into the inky darkness of the night, he realized something profound. Even if they did rebuild, even if they did find their way back to each other, he couldn't shake the feeling that a part of him had already been lost. He had built his empire, his wealth, but in doing so, he had lost himself. And that realization was more frightening than anything he had ever faced. A knock at the door broke his train of thought, sharp and sudden. Ethan pushed himself off the bed, his body stiff, and walked toward the door, half expecting it to be Claire. But when he opened it, he was met with the last person he expected. Emma. She stood there, looking as beautiful as ever, but with a weariness in her eyes that matched his own. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and she was dressed casually, though the expression on her face made it clear that this was not a social call. "Emma?" Ethan said, surprise flooding his voice. "What are you doing here?" "I had to see you," she said, her voice quiet, yet heavy with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. I couldn't just leave things the way they were, Ethan. I couldn't walk away without giving you one last chance." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, the tension between them palpable. He had expected anger, resentment, maybe even bitterness. But what he saw in her eyes wasn't that. It was vulnerability, a rawness he hadn't seen before. "Emma?" He wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. How could he explain the confusion, the pain, the mess he had created? "I don't want your apologies," she said, cutting him off, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I don't want your regret. I don't want your guilt. I need to understand. Did you ever really care about me, Ethan? Or was I just another distraction?" Her words hit him like a wave, crashing over him, pulling him under. The truth was that he didn't know. He had cared about her, but it had always been tangled in the complexities of his life. He had been so lost in his own world, his marriage, his business, his own emptiness, that he had never given her the space to be more than that. "I thought you understood what this was," he said quietly, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. I thought I could give you something, even if it wasn't everything." "You gave me nothing," Emma said, her voice shaking now, but there was a sadness in her eyes that he hadn't expected. "You used me, Ethan, and I let you. I let you because I thought it would be enough. But it wasn't. It never was." Ethan stepped closer, his mind racing for the right words, but none came. He could feel the chasm between them growing wider with every second, and he realized with a sickening clarity that nothing he could say would undo the damage. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I never wanted to do that. But I was so lost. I was so focused on everything else that I couldn't see what I was doing to you. To myself." Emma shook her head, her eyes wet with tears she hadn't let fall until now. "You're not the man I thought you were, Ethan. And I'm not the woman I thought I was either. I was so blinded by your wealth, by what I thought was love, that I couldn't see the truth. I couldn't see that you weren't the answer to my emptiness, and neither was I to yours." Her words cut deep, but they were the truth. Ethan had used her as a bandage, an escape from the suffocating reality of his life. He had let her believe that she was something more, but in reality, she was just another distraction. Just as he had been for Claire. And now, standing here with Emma, he realized that the person he had been running from all this time was himself. "You deserve more than this, Emma," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You deserve someone who can give you what you need, not just someone who's pretending to be whole. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She didn't say anything for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. "I don't need your apology, Ethan. I need you to face the truth. You have to face who you are, who you've become. Until you do, you'll never be able to give anyone what they need. Not Claire, not me, not even yourself." She paused, her eyes searching his, and for a brief moment Ethan thought she might reach out, might offer him some kind of forgiveness, but instead she just looked at him with an expression that was both sad and resigned. "I came here to give you a chance to change," Emma said, her voice trembling, "but I can't make that change for you. Only you can do that." With those final words, she turned and walked toward the door. Ethan watched her leave, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the hallway, and for the first time, he truly understood what he had lost. The door clicked softly behind her, and Ethan stood there staring at the space she had just occupied. He was alone again, but this time, the silence was different. This time it wasn't just the absence of another person. It was the absence of everything he had ever built, everything he had ever believed in. He had spent his life running from the truth, and now the truth had caught up with him. The question was, what was he going to do about it? The next few days in the Hamptons passed in a blur of emotional exhaustion. Ethan had spent the first night after Emma's departure pacing the house, his mind a cyclone of regret, self-loathing, and confusion. His marriage was crumbling, his affair had fallen apart, and the empire he had so carefully built, brick by brick, seemed to be dissolving before his eyes. For the first time, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. He had tried to reach out to Claire. He had tried to explain, to offer her some kind of explanation for his failings. But her responses were distant, polite even, but devoid of the warmth they had once shared. It was as though she had already moved on, and part of him, though he would never admit it, was grateful for that. He didn't know if he could bear the weight of her disappointment any longer. His phone buzzed, and the screen lit up with a message from James, his assistant. The text was brief, but enough to pull him from his spiraling thoughts. "Ethan, I've called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. The Miami situation is getting worse. We need to act fast." Ethan stared at the message, his pulse quickening. For a fleeting moment he considered ignoring it. After all, what did it matter? His company, his wealth, had been the very thing that had distanced him from the people who mattered most. But then the reality of the situation set in. If the business was falling apart, if he let it slip through his fingers, then what would he have left? With a sigh, Ethan typed a quick reply. "I'll be there." He dropped the phone on the desk, feeling the weight of his choices pressing down on him again. It had always been about the next deal, the next acquisition, the next victory. But as he looked around the room, at the ocean view, at the grand furniture, at the life he had created, he couldn't shake the feeling that all of it was meaningless. And still, he was left with the question, what now? He stood and moved toward the window, watching the waves crash against the shore. He had built a world of luxury, of pristine beauty, but in the silence, he was reminded of something essential. None of it had ever been enough. The next morning, Ethan found himself sitting in the conference room of his Manhattan office, surrounded by the same faces that had once admired him for his brilliance and drive. Now, as he entered, they barely looked up, their gazes colder, more calculating. They were all waiting for him to fix things, to clean up the mess he had created. James greeted him at the door, his expression unreadable. "We've been doing damage control all night. The press is starting to get hold of the story, and if we don't take action, it could sink us. We need to address the board and make decisions. Fast." Ethan nodded, feeling the familiar pressure weighing on him again. But today, it felt different. Today the stakes weren't just about stock prices or business acquisitions. Today, everything felt personal. The boardroom was long and sterile, a reflection of the cold, corporate world Ethan had come to embody. His seat at the head of the table was a place he had once claimed with pride, but now it felt more like a throne in a crumbling kingdom. The board members sat around him, their faces indifferent, their conversations hushed. Ethan cleared his throat and stood, placing his hands on the cold, polished surface of the table. "I know things have been difficult recently," he began, his voice carrying across the room, despite the tightness in his chest. "The Miami project has spiraled out of control, and I take full responsibility for that." The room fell silent, but not in the way he had hoped. There was no sympathy, no understanding, only an uncomfortable, expectant quiet. He could almost feel their judgment hanging in the air. "We have a plan to contain the damage," he continued, trying to steady his nerves. "But it's going to require all of us to make sacrifices. I'm willing to take a hit personally, if it means saving the company." The board members exchanged looks, murmurs passing between them, but no one spoke. Ethan knew what they were thinking. They wanted results, not promises, and he had nothing left to offer but words. Finally, one of the senior members, a woman named Margaret, spoke up. "We appreciate your commitment, Ethan, but let's be honest. Your personal situation is affecting your leadership. There's a perception problem here. If we don't get ahead of this crisis, we'll lose everything we've worked for." The words hit Ethan harder than he expected. The last thing he wanted was to be seen as weak, someone who had let his personal life affect his ability to lead. But deep down he knew Margaret was right. His eyes flickered to James, who was sitting at the far end of the table. James gave him a brief nod, a silent gesture that seemed to say, "This is it, Ethan. This is where you make your choice." Ethan's mind raced as he looked around the room at the men and women who had built empires on the foundation he had created. For so long he had been driven by the desire to prove himself, to build something that would outlast him. But now, as the weight of the board's expectations pressed on him, he couldn't ignore the truth that had been whispering in the back of his mind. He had sacrificed everything to reach this point, and it had all come at the cost of his happiness. The board meeting continued, but Ethan barely heard the rest of the discussion. The decisions, the strategies, the corporate jargon, all of it seemed like background noise to him now. All he could think about was Claire and Emma, and the life he had chosen to leave behind. Later that evening, as Ethan sat in his office, alone with his thoughts, he couldn't escape the nagging feeling that his life was spiraling beyond his control. He had thought he could juggle his marriage, his business, and his affairs, but now he understood. None of it had been sustainable. He had sacrificed pieces of himself along the way, pieces that could never be replaced. And yet, despite everything, there was a flicker of hope inside him. A quiet voice that said it wasn't too late. That maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild, not just his empire, but his life. He picked up the phone and dialed Claire's number. Her voice, when it answered, was distant. But this time, there was something in her tone, a softness, that made his heart skip a beat. "I need to see you," he said, his voice raw, vulnerable. "I'm ready to face whatever comes next. But I need you, Claire. I don't know how to do this without you." The hours between the phone call and their meeting felt like an eternity. Ethan sat in his office, his fingers tracing the edge of his desk, his mind spinning. He had never felt so uncertain, so vulnerable. The boardroom was filled with power and expectation. But here, with Claire, he was simply a man seeking forgiveness, a man trying to come to terms with the damage he had done. When he had called her earlier, he had been terrified. Terrified that she might hang up, that she might refuse to see him. He had braced himself for her to tell him it was too late, that the damage was irreparable. But instead, her voice had been calm. Her words, though guarded, had hinted at something he hadn't expected. Hope. Now, as he paced in the quiet of his office, waiting for her to arrive, he realized that he was no longer the man who had walked into this world of wealth and power. The person he had become was a stranger, a man who had lost himself in his pursuit of everything he thought mattered, and who was now left with the ruins of his relationships. The door to his office opened, and Ethan turned, his breath catching in his throat. Claire stood in the doorway, looking as beautiful and composed as ever. But beneath the calm exterior, he could see the remnants of her pain in her eyes. Her expression was neutral, but there was a guardedness to her that made his heart ache. "Claire," he said, his voice hoarse, "thank you for coming." She stepped into the room but didn't approach him right away. Instead, she paused by the window, her back turned to him as she gazed out over the city. The familiar view seemed distant now, just as distant as the life they had once shared. "You've been making a lot of decisions without me, Ethan," she said, her voice soft, but with a hint of something sharper underneath. "I'm not sure why you think I should come back into your life so easily." Ethan swallowed hard. He knew that he had no right to ask for her forgiveness, no right to expect anything from her. but he couldn't deny the yearning inside him, the desire to fix what he had broken. "I never meant to shut you out, Claire," he said, stepping toward her slowly, his voice filled with quiet urgency. "I was so focused on the wrong things, so consumed by my own failures, that I didn't see how I was losing you. Losing us. I've spent years trying to build something, but I've lost everything that truly mattered in the process." Claire didn't turn around. She didn't need to. The pain in his voice was enough. She had always known that Ethan was driven by something deeper than ambition, something darker, something he had never fully understood. It wasn't just about the business or the wealth. It was about running from the things that scared him, running from the reality of who he was, of what he had done. "I don't know what to do with you, Ethan," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can just forgive you. I don't know if I can trust you again." Ethan took another step closer, and this time she didn't pull away. Her back was still to him, but he could feel the tension between them, the years of silence and unspoken hurt swirling in the space they shared. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Claire," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm asking for a chance to prove that I can change, to prove that I can be the man you deserve." For a long moment, there was only silence. The city outside seemed to hum in the background, but Ethan's world was entirely focused on the woman standing in front of him, the woman who had loved him, who had stood by him, and who now seemed so far removed from the person she had once been. Finally, Claire turned around, her face softening just a fraction. Her eyes were tired, but they still held that spark, the strength that had always drawn him to her. "You say you can change," she said, her gaze steady on his. "But I don't think you even understand what you've done, Ethan. It's not just about the affair. It's about the fact that you've shut me out for years. I've been living in this marriage with a man who was physically present, but emotionally absent. And I don't know if I can go back to that." Ethan's chest tightened at her words. He had known, deep down, that this wasn't just about Emma. It wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about years of neglect, years of him being so consumed with his own ambitions that he had forgotten to nurture the one thing that had always mattered: his marriage. "I was a coward," he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "I was afraid to face myself, to face the fact that I wasn't the man I thought I was. And I took that out on you. I shut you out because I didn't want to face the truth. But I can't keep living like this, Claire. I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it's falling apart." Claire's expression softened, but only slightly. She crossed the room and sat down at the edge of the chair, her hands folded in her lap. "Ethan, I've been pretending too. I've been pretending that things were okay, that I could handle it. But I've been suffocating in silence. I've been watching you destroy everything we built, and I don't know if I can keep watching it happen." The truth hung between them like a heavy weight, but there was also something else, something fragile and tentative: hope. Ethan could feel it, pulsing in the air around them. "I don't expect you to just forgive me, Claire," he said quietly. "I know I've hurt you. I know I've hurt us. But I need you to understand that I'm willing to fight for us. For you. If you'll let me." Claire looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his, as though trying to see through the layers of guilt and regret. "I don't know if I can love you the way I did," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "But I don't know if I can let go either. I don't know if I'm ready to walk away from everything we've built together." Ethan's heart swelled in his chest, a bittersweet ache. It wasn't an answer. It wasn't a promise. But it was something. And for the first time in what felt like forever, it was enough. He knew that rebuilding would take time, if it was even possible, but at least now, they were no longer pretending. "I'm here, Claire," he said, his voice steady, "and I'm not going anywhere." As the silence stretched between them, Ethan realized that, in that moment, the future wasn't a certainty, but the possibility of it, the possibility of healing, of starting over, was something they both could work toward. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid to try. The days following their conversation were filled with a tense, fragile silence. Ethan couldn't quite shake the weight of Claire's words, the admission that they were both living in a marriage that had become more about survival than love. For the first time, he truly understood the depth of his own failures. Not just to Claire, but to himself. He had built an empire of concrete and steel, but he had never bothered to build the foundation of his own happiness. Still, the small steps they had taken toward understanding were the first real movement in what had felt like a frozen, broken relationship. Claire was there, in the house with him, but she wasn't really with him. Not yet. And Ethan knew that he had to do more than just apologize. He had to show her that he was willing to put in the work, to prove that he could be the man she had always hoped he could be. The silence that stretched between them was still full of tension, but it was different now. It wasn't the silence of avoidance. It was the silence of two people trying to rebuild something fragile. Ethan found himself spending more time at the office than he had in the past few days. Despite his internal turmoil, the reality of his company was still pressing down on him. The board's growing concerns about the Miami scandal still loomed large, and he had to act fast to prevent further damage. The public's interest in his personal life had become a media frenzy, and every move he made seemed to be scrutinized under a magnifying glass. James, his assistant, was a constant presence in these meetings, reminding him of what had to be done next. "We've delayed the statement long enough, Ethan. The press is already running wild with their speculations. You need to take control of the narrative," James had said earlier in the week. Ethan had agreed, but it felt more like a requirement than a choice. But as he sat in his office, staring at the chaotic mess of emails and messages that seemed to pile up faster than he could address them, a part of him wished that all the noise would just stop. That for once, he could focus on something real. The knock on his office door broke his concentration. He looked up to find Claire standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. He hadn't expected her to come by today, not after everything that had been said between them. But there she was. "Can we talk?" Her voice was steady, but there was something in her eyes, something tentative and fragile. Ethan pushed aside his papers and stood up, a rush of emotion flooding through him. "Of course, come in." He moved around his desk, his heart pounding in his chest. The truth was, he wasn't sure what to expect from this conversation, but he knew it was important. They couldn't keep living in this limbo, where words and apologies didn't seem enough. Claire stepped inside, but she didn't sit down. Instead, she stood near the window, looking out at the city below. She was silent for a long time, and Ethan wasn't sure if she was gathering her thoughts or just avoiding his gaze. Finally, she spoke. "I've been thinking about what you said, about how we've been living in a marriage of convenience, just going through the motions." Ethan's chest tightened. He had known she would say something like that. She had every right to. "I know it's not enough, Claire," he said quietly. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, but I need you to know that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to rebuild what we had. I don't want to keep pretending." Claire turned to face him then, her eyes searching his. "Do you even know what that would look like? What it would take?" Ethan swallowed. The truth was, he didn't know. Not really. But for the first time in years, he realized that he needed to be okay with not having all the answers. "I know it won't be easy. I don't expect it to be. But I want to try." I want to face what we've avoided for so long. I want us to have a chance. To rebuild, if you'll let me." Claire's expression softened, but only slightly. She looked away for a moment, as if trying to process everything. Ethan could see the conflict in her eyes. She wanted to believe him, but there were walls in place that couldn't be torn down with a few words. "I don't know if I can do that," she said quietly, the weight of her words hanging in the air. "I don't know if I can trust you again, but I also don't know if I'm ready to let go of everything we've built, of everything we were." Ethan felt a pang of guilt in his chest. He had never realized how much Claire had sacrificed to keep their life together, how much she had held on to, even when he had let go. "I've failed you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've failed us, and I don't know how to fix it, but I'm not asking for us to go back to what we were. I need a chance to prove I can be better, to prove that I can be the man you need." Claire didn't say anything for a long moment. She simply stood there, looking at him. It was as if she was weighing his words, deciding whether she could allow herself to believe them. Finally, she spoke again, her voice soft but firm. "I don't think I can forgive you right now, Ethan. I don't think I'm even ready to fully trust you again. But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to see if you can show me, not just with your words, but with your actions." Ethan's heart surged. It wasn't everything he wanted, but it was a beginning. It was a crack in the wall they had built around themselves, a crack that he could work to widen. He took a step toward her, his voice quiet but resolute. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for being willing to try." Claire nodded, though her expression remained cautious. "But there's something else, Ethan. Something I need to say." Ethan paused, his breath catching in his throat. "What is it?" Claire looked at him, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. "I'm not sure I can stay in this marriage if you don't change, if you don't show me that you're willing to do the work. It's not just about the affair. It's about everything, the way we've let this drift for so long." Ethan nodded, understanding the weight of her words. It wasn't just about him fixing things. It was about both of them, about finding a way to make this marriage work, not just for the sake of appearances, but for themselves. "I'll do whatever it takes," he promised, his voice steady now. "I'll prove to you that I'm ready to change. For you. For us." And in that moment, as Claire turned to leave, he realized that this was the beginning of something. Not a perfect solution, not an easy answer, but a chance to rebuild a life they had both almost lost. Ethan spent the next few days in a haze of self-reflection. The conversations with Claire had been hard but necessary. The shift in their dynamic, the delicate balance of hope and uncertainty, was a heavy burden. He had spent so many years running from his own emotions, burying himself in work and ambition, that facing the truth now felt like learning to walk all over again. He couldn't avoid the truth anymore. He had always thought success would fill the emptiness inside of him, but it hadn't. The thought of losing Claire, of losing the chance to rebuild what they had, gnawed at him constantly. But there was also the looming specter of his empire, the business that had given him everything he thought he wanted. As much as he hated to admit it, the weight of his responsibilities still held him captive. The phone buzzed on his desk, snapping him out of his thoughts. "James." Ethan hesitated before answering. "Ethan, we need to talk. The board wants answers. There's been more media fallout about the Miami scandal." James's voice came through the line, tight and urgent. "They're pushing for a public statement, and frankly, they want you to handle it. They believe you're the only one who can salvage this." Ethan's gut twisted. There it was again, the pull of the business, the very thing that had defined his existence for so long, the thing that kept him tethered to a world he was growing increasingly disillusioned with. He could feel the weight of the board's expectations pressing down on him. "I know," Ethan replied, his voice flat. "I'll handle it. Set the meeting up for tomorrow morning." His fingers hovered over the phone as the weight of his responsibilities lingered in the air. Claire had asked for him to change, to prove that he could be the man she needed. But now, faced with the mounting pressures of his company, he was left wondering how much of himself he was willing to sacrifice. The next morning, Ethan found himself standing before the board once again, this time in a room that felt even more distant than usual. The business suits, the cold demeanor of his fellow board members, they felt like ghosts, reminders of a world he could no longer pretend to belong to. James stood at his side, eyes locked on Ethan with a mix of expectation and concern. He could tell that Ethan was distracted, the weight of his personal struggles seeping into his professional life. "We need a solid plan of action, Ethan," Margaret, a senior board member, said, her voice like ice. "The press is running wild. Our stocks are plummeting. You can't afford to hesitate." "I'm not hesitating," Ethan replied, his voice firmer than he felt. "I've got it under control." "Under control? Or under the rug?" Margaret pressed, her gaze piercing. "We need a public statement. We need to show the world that we're still capable of leading this company, that you're still the man who built it." Ethan looked around the table at the faces that had once admired him, now all too aware of the cracks in his persona. The reality of the situation hit him with sudden clarity. No matter what he did, the cracks were still there, visible for all to see. The scandal was just the surface. The real problem was much deeper. "I'll handle the statement," Ethan said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "But I need you all to trust that I'm doing what's necessary to fix this." The meeting continued, but Ethan felt detached, as though he were watching from the outside. His mind kept drifting back to Claire, to the fragile moment they had shared just a few days ago. He knew that whatever decision he made here would carry weight, both in the business world and in his personal life. When the meeting finally ended, Ethan left the room in a daze, his head spinning with the magnitude of what lay ahead. James caught up to him in the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the otherwise empty corridor. "You know this isn't just about the business, right?" James said, his voice low, almost sympathetic. "The press, the board, they're just a distraction. What's going on with Claire is what really matters." Ethan stopped in his tracks, turning to face James. His assistant's words hit harder than he expected, and for a moment he was almost angry. How could James understand? How could anyone understand the pressure of trying to hold everything together when it felt like everything was falling apart? "I'm doing everything I can, James," Ethan said, his voice tight. "But this company, this is what I've built. I can't just let it go. Not now." "I get it," James replied, his tone more measured. "But if you lose Claire, you'll lose everything you've worked for. Don't let this business consume you to the point where it costs you the only thing that really matters." Ethan stared at James, his mind racing. He wanted to dismiss his assistant's advice. He wanted to say that this was just business, that he had no choice but to follow through. But the truth gnawed at him. James was right. That night, Ethan sat alone in his penthouse, staring out at the glittering lights of Manhattan. He had drafted the statement for the press release, but every word felt hollow. The words were easy, polished, carefully crafted to protect the company's image. But they didn't mean anything. They didn't reflect who he was or what he was becoming. He heard the soft click of the door behind him. Claire entered, her presence calm but purposeful. She didn't say anything at first, just stood in the doorway, watching him as he sat in the shadows, his back to her. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and for a brief moment, He thought of all the things he had yet to say, all the apologies he hadn't yet earned. "I've been thinking," Claire said softly, her voice carrying the weight of uncertainty, "about everything you said, about what you want." Ethan turned to face her, his chest tight. "Claire, I know I've messed up. I know I've hurt you. But I can't keep running from what's real, from what we had, from what we can still have." Claire stepped closer, her gaze steady. "I'm not asking for perfection, Ethan. I'm asking for honesty. I'm asking for you to be here, fully, with me, with yourself." Ethan stood, stepping toward her. He reached for her hand, and for a moment their fingers brushed, lightly, tentatively, as if testing the waters of a connection that had been buried for too long. "I can do that," he said quietly. "But I need you to know, Claire, this is no longer just about the business. This is about us." And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Ethan realized that he was finally ready to make the hard choice, to choose love over power. The following days felt like a slow unraveling. Ethan tried to focus on the statement that was scheduled for release, but his mind kept returning to Claire, to the delicate thread of hope they had started to rebuild. The fragile moments they shared in the penthouse seemed like an oasis amidst the chaos of his life, a life that had been filled with the pursuit of power, of wealth, of outward success, but had left him hollow inside. He wasn't sure what would come of his relationship with Claire, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was truly trying to face the truth. It wasn't just about the scandal anymore. It wasn't just about the press or the company, or even his failed affair with Emma. It was about him, his choices, his mistakes, and whether he had the courage to make things right. But as much as he wanted to be present with Claire, to truly understand what she needed, the demands of the business world were unrelenting. The phone calls, the meetings, the endless waves of crises. Every time he tried to step away, the pressure built up again. Ethan leaned back in his chair in the conference room, looking around at the board members who had once been his trusted allies, but now seemed more like distant observers. He was no longer the man they had admired, the brilliant CEO who had always delivered. They had seen the cracks in his facade, and though they remained silent, he could feel their judgment hanging in the air like a fog. "We've drafted the statement," Margaret, the senior board member, said, pushing a file across the table toward him. "But we're still waiting on your approval. We need to be sure this is the right approach before we release it." Ethan picked up the file, his mind half on the words in front of him and half on Claire. The pressure of the boardroom was suffocating, and his heart was heavy with the knowledge that the choices he made in these next few moments could shape not just his company, but his future with Claire as well. "You can release it as soon as I approve it," Ethan said, his voice more distant than he intended. "But we also need to address the media's growing concerns about my personal life. I'll handle it." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Personal life? You mean the affair?" Ethan tensed, but he kept his voice steady. "Yes, that. We can't ignore the narrative out there any longer. We need to address it head on. Let's not let it continue to taint the company's image." There was a long pause. Margaret exchanged a look with the other board members. Ethan could sense their doubt, whether about him or his ability to fix this mess he had created. They weren't just worried about the company's image. They were worried about his image. And he knew deep down that they weren't the only ones. The world was watching. That night, after the board meeting ended and the weight of the business world settled back onto his shoulders, Ethan returned home, but the apartment felt different. The silence in the penthouse was no longer peaceful. It was a heavy quiet, filled with the unspoken words between him and Claire. He found her in the living room, staring out at the city from the window, her arms wrapped around herself. She was beautiful, even in the soft glow of the evening lights. But there was a sadness in her posture that broke something inside of him. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice thick with guilt as he stood by the door. "I know I'm not here the way I should be. I've been consumed by everything outside of this place, outside of us. I just don't know how to fix it." Claire turned slowly, her face unreadable. "Ethan, I'm not asking you to fix everything. I'm asking you to be real, to be here with me, to be here with yourself." He took a step toward her, but she held up a hand, stopping him. "I know you're trying, and that's something," she continued, her voice quiet, measured. "But I don't know if it's enough. We've both been pretending for so long, Ethan. We've been living in the illusion of what we think we have. But you can't keep running from the truth." Ethan's heart pounded. He could feel the weight of her words, the sting of what she was saying. She was right. He had spent years running from his own mistakes, from the truth about who he was and what he needed. "I'm not running anymore," he said, his voice shaking. "I can't. But I don't know how to undo everything I've done. I don't know if I can fix it. I don't know if I can fix us." Claire stepped closer, her eyes softening. She reached out and touched his arm gently. "It's not about fixing us, Ethan. It's about being willing to try. It's about being honest with me, with yourself. You don't need to have all the answers, but you can't keep pretending that everything's fine. You have to want this, want us, as much as you want everything else." Her words hung in the air, like a lifeline he was too afraid to reach for. But the truth of them sank deep into his chest. She was right. He had been so consumed by his ambition, his fear of failure, that he had lost sight of what really mattered. And now, standing before her, he knew that he had to choose between the life he had built and the love that had always been right in front of him. "I want this," he said finally, his voice firm. "I want us. But I don't know if I'm enough, Claire. I don't know if I can be the man you need." Claire's gaze softened, and for the first time in a long while she smiled, a small, tentative smile that held both sadness and something deeper. "You've already started, Ethan. That's all I need to see. We'll take this one step at a time. But don't expect me to fix you. You have to want to fix yourself." Her words were like a weight lifting from his chest. For the first time, Ethan felt as though he wasn't carrying the burden of the world alone. But the road ahead would be long. He knew that. "Thank you," he whispered, "for giving me a chance." "I'm not giving you a chance," Claire said softly, her hand resting on his chest. "I'm giving us a chance, and you need to be ready for it." The tension between them had shifted, but it wasn't gone. Ethan knew they had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like they might just make it. Ethan woke early the next morning, the early light of dawn creeping through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. He sat up slowly, feeling the weight of everything that had changed in the past few weeks. The air in the penthouse was still, quiet, almost peaceful. But in his chest, a storm brewed. For the first time in a long while, he was awake before the world around him demanded his attention. No emails, no meetings, no phone calls, just the sound of his own breathing and the soft hum of the city below. For a fleeting moment, he wondered what life would be like if he allowed himself to embrace this stillness, to stay present with Claire without the constant need to prove himself. But the world didn't work that way. Not for him. Not yet. His mind drifted to the meeting he would have later with the board, the press statement he had yet to finalize, the crisis in Miami still threatening to unravel everything he had worked for. All the professional chaos that demanded his attention felt even more suffocating now that he had begun to see where he had failed in the personal part of his life. The tension between these two worlds, his business and his marriage, felt increasingly impossible to balance. Claire had made it clear. If he was to salvage anything of their relationship, he had to be present. Not just physically, but emotionally. He had to prove he could be the man she needed, and that meant showing up for her in ways he hadn't for years. She had also made it clear that she wasn't interested in grand gestures. What she needed was honesty, consistency, and patience. Things that came easily to him in business but were foreign when it came to matters of the heart. Ethan rose from the bed, the weight of the day ahead pressing down on him. But as he moved through the penthouse, preparing himself for the challenges of the day, he knew that this was different. This time, he wasn't just trying to fix things for the sake of appearances. He was fixing things because he wanted to, because he had no choice if he wanted to keep Claire in his life. Claire had spent the morning in her studio, the art she created providing the kind of solace she had been missing for too long. Her mind had been consumed with thoughts of Ethan, of the delicate steps they were both taking to rebuild their trust. But in the solitude of her work, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her since the cracks in their marriage first began to appear. She needed this, more than she had realized. The quiet space where she could just be. It wasn't just the uncertainty of their relationship that made her restless. It was the uncertainty about herself. Over the years, she had poured so much of her energy into Ethan, into their life together, that she had lost sight of the woman she used to be. The woman who had built her own career, her own identity. Now, she was torn between wanting to nurture what was left of their marriage and reclaiming the parts of herself that had been neglected in the process. She stood at the canvas, brush in hand, but her mind kept wandering. Ethan had been trying. She could see that. He was doing the work, attempting to change, attempting to put her first. But change, real change, wasn't easy. It would take time, more time than either of them had the luxury of. The door to the studio opened and Claire turned to see Ethan standing in the doorway, his posture relaxed but his expression uncertain. For a moment she saw the man who had captivated her all those years ago, the man who had been driven by a need for connection, even if he had never known how to form it. "You're up early," Claire said, setting her brush down and wiping her hands on a cloth. "I couldn't sleep," Ethan admitted, stepping into the room. His eyes searched hers, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Claire saw the vulnerability in his gaze. "I've been thinking about everything. About us. About what we need," she asked, her voice steady but full of quiet hope. He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I know I've been a mess. I've been running from my own mistakes, and I know I've hurt you. I don't know how to make it all right, but I want to try. I need to show you that I can be who you need me to be, who I should have been all along." Claire's heart ached. He was finally saying the things she had needed to hear for so long, but the question lingered. Was it enough? Could a man who had spent so long in his own world of ambition, who had shut her out time and time again, truly change? "I know you're trying, Ethan," Claire said softly, "but trying isn't enough. You're right. You've hurt me. We've both hurt each other. And I can't keep pretending that everything is fine just because you say the words. You have to show me you mean it. You have to show me through your actions, not just your promises." Ethan's expression tightened, but there was no defensiveness in his voice, only determination. "I'm not asking for you to forgive me right away, Claire. I'm not asking for everything to be fixed in a day. But I need you to know that I am here, and I'm not going anywhere. I want to be the man you deserve, the man I should have been." Claire studied him for a moment, her heart torn between the man who had once been her partner in life and the man who had let her down so many times. "It's not just about you anymore, Ethan. It's about us, and about whether we can build something real this time. I need you to understand that the work starts now. It's not just words. It's actions, small steps, every day." Ethan took a slow step toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. "I understand," he said, his voice low and steady, "and I'm ready to take those steps, with you, if you'll let me." For a long moment, Claire said nothing. She didn't know what would come next. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with more questions than answers. But there was something in Ethan's eyes, something raw, something real, that told her he wasn't just asking for a second chance. He was asking for a future, for a way forward, together. Finally, Claire nodded, a soft smile playing on her lips. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's take the first step." As Ethan stood there, the weight of her words settling into his chest, he realized that this was no longer just about what he wanted. It was about what they both needed. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was ready to give it. All of it. The weeks that followed the fragile reconciliation felt like both a slow rebirth and an overwhelming reckoning. Ethan's life, once filled with the noise of business calls, press conferences, and endless demands, had shifted in a way that felt almost impossible to grasp. He had expected the change to be a grand gesture, a dramatic shift in the way he saw the world. But instead, it had come in small, quiet moments. Moments where he chose to be present, to truly listen to Claire, to understand not just what she needed, but what he needed. Every day was a new beginning. He had taken the steps, no matter how small, to rebuild the trust that had been broken. He hadn't just thrown himself into his work. Instead, he took the time to be with Claire, to support her in the quiet moments, to understand her world beyond the walls of their marriage. For the first time, Ethan was showing up, not just for the business world, but for the woman he loved. He was learning that love was never about grand promises or sweeping gestures. It was about the quiet, consistent actions that built trust over time. But still, even as he worked to repair what had been damaged, he knew there was one more decision he had to make, one that would change the course of his life, forever. It was late afternoon when Ethan found himself sitting at the small cafe near their apartment, a cup of coffee cooling in front of him, the steam dissipating into the cool air. The city buzzed around him, but he felt oddly disconnected from the hustle of it all. He wasn't here for a business meeting. He wasn't here for anything urgent. He was here because he had made a decision, one that had been quietly forming in the back of his mind for weeks. The phone in his pocket buzzed. It was a message from James, his assistant. "The board is asking for your final decision on the Miami project. They're ready to make the announcement as soon as you confirm." Ethan stared at the message for a long time. The board was expecting him to make a choice, one that would secure the company's future, but perhaps at the cost of his own peace of mind. His mind flashed to the countless meetings he had attended, the relentless push for more, for bigger, for faster. But as the world outside the cafe moved at its usual pace, Ethan knew what he had to do. He had spent his life trying to outpace time, trying to prove himself to everyone but the people who truly mattered. The company was built on his shoulders, and it had become a symbol of his worth. But he was beginning to see that success, true success, was never about the bottom line. It was about the people you loved and the legacy you built with them, not the numbers on a spreadsheet. Ethan stood up and walked to the counter, his decision clear in his mind. He could no longer chase wealth at the cost of his personal life. The company, though important, was not everything. He didn't need to be the man who had it all. He needed to be the man who was there, for Claire, for himself. When he walked into their apartment that evening, Claire was standing by the window, watching the sunset over the city. The sight of her, still and contemplative, filled him with a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. He had spent so much time running from the truth, from the choices that truly mattered, but now he was ready to be the man she needed. "Claire," Ethan said softly, his voice filled with resolve. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "What is it, Ethan?" He stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. "I've made my decision, about the business, about everything." Claire's brow furrowed slightly, but she didn't speak. She waited for him to continue. "I'm stepping down," he said, the words tasting like freedom, "from the company. I'm not going to keep running it, not like this. I've spent so much of my life consumed by it, thinking it was the only thing that mattered. But I know now, what really matters is us, you. And I can't keep sacrificing my life for something that doesn't give me what I need. I can't keep pretending it's the only thing that defines me." For a long moment, Claire didn't say anything. Her gaze softened as she looked at him, and Ethan could see the surprise in her eyes. He held his breath, unsure of what she would say next. "You're doing this for us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," he said, his voice steady. "For us. For me." Claire stepped forward, her eyes locking onto his. "You're willing to give it all up?" Ethan nodded, his heart in his throat. "I've spent too many years running, Claire. Running from the man I was. Running from the love I wanted but was too afraid to accept. I don't want to keep running anymore. I want to build something real. Something lasting." Tears welled up in Claire's eyes, and she reached out, taking his hands in hers. "I don't know if this is the right decision, Ethan. I don't know if you're ready for what comes next. But I know one thing, you're trying. You're showing up for me, for us. And that's more than I could have ever asked for." "I'm not asking for perfection, Claire," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm asking for a chance. To be the man you've always deserved. To build a life with you, not just a business." Claire smiled softly, her tears slipping down her cheeks. She reached up to touch his face, her fingers brushing away the tears he hadn't realized were falling. "You've already given me everything I need, Ethan. This is the start of something new. For both of us." Ethan pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, the weight of the world lifting from his shoulders. It wasn't perfect. They still had work to do, still had hurdles to face. But in that moment, with Claire in his arms, he knew that the decision he had made, letting go of his empire to embrace love and connection, was the right one. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was finally home,